I mentioned getting student buy-in first because I really believe that as they are the learners, that's really key to getting other stakeholders to kind of fall in line and give their buy-in as well. So my main strategy for getting parent buy-in, as I've tried to illustrate with my stick figures, is to gain student buy-in. So really, I'm suggesting that passionate students and passionate learners will continue to they will continue to convince others that a flipped classroom is valuable simply by doing good work, for participating in class, for singing the praises of a flipped class. So what I've noticed happening is that parents have started to ask their students questions like, what is your homework? And in a flipped class, that answer is very different than it has traditionally been. Oftentimes it is to watch videos, and so as students come home more and more capable, parents start to also love a flipped class as well. So the more student buy-in you can get, the more likely it is that your parents are going to buy in as well. A couple of anecdotes that I'd like to share as well. In one case, my seniors, again, as I mentioned, were sent home with a chapter from the Khan book, and the student left it laying about, I think, on the dining room table, and her parents found it. And they were curious as to what it was and interested, and so they read the chapter. And these parents are also educators, so they happened to discover or to become more familiar with the flipped classroom idea and why the Prussian paradigm is no longer meeting students' needs because of the student's interest and the student leaving the documentation. Often, I've also heard parents tell me that they have learned from the videos that my students have watched, or that they have seen their student actually become very engaged in aspects of, for instance, editing the wiki that were not required. I had one young lady who took it upon herself to establish the structure of the wiki that all other students were then using to contribute their content. I had another who decided to kind of go behind the scenes and add some what are called widgets to increase accessibility and add kind of bells and whistles to our wiki as well. So students taking ownership has always been a successful way of getting parent buy-in. The other thing to keep in mind is that a flipped class, if it is your intention, can easily become very, very public. You have a very authentic audience whenever you're using the internet, and again, that is if you want one. You could always kind of put your flipped classroom within some barriers to keep out some public interaction. But if you'd like to, you may certainly engage parents and seek their expertise, their questions, their real-world concerns about students' education. Furthermore, you can engage educators in the post-secondary fields, or you may also engage workers in the community. So the barriers between students and the real world that we always speak to them about start to dissolve in a flipped classroom, which again gets parent buy-in. So making relevant to parents the value of a flipped classroom and the irrelevance of our continued use of the Prussian paradigm is the main strategy by which I have been successful in gaining parent buy-in. A key thing to keep in mind when seeking support from administration in moving to a flipped classroom and eschewing the Prussian paradigm is really that good educational leaders have always had in mind the success of their students. It can be easy sometimes to get sucked into these sometimes false and arbitrary measures of student success that bureaucracies often use, and education is certainly a bureaucracy, but good educational leaders, and we have many of them at Hilton, recognize that what makes sense for student learning makes sense to support. And there are several ways in which you can communicate this. And I think the key step in getting administrator support in any district is to be transparent with the reasons behind your methodology. And this class is designed to strengthen your methodology and your understanding of why a flipped classroom is sound pedagogy. So in my case, again, to give you a couple of examples, gaining administration approval, I very strategically made my successes administration successes. So as students became more competent, this of course is evidence of my strong instruction and my strong instruction being supported by administration makes administration look good. So again, when I look good, administration looks good, and likewise, when I look bad, so does administration. So there is this need to support my continued efforts to improve by the administration. I made that very deliberate in a couple of ways. For instance, I invited administration in to observe my classroom while we were transitioning into the flipped class. And I engaged very authentically and very transparently that I thought there were opportunities for myself to improve. For instance, in one case, I invited the high school principal to observe as I had mini conferences with students on thesis statements after assigning what a thesis statement was for homework the night before. My concern was that while I was working with one student very publicly in front of the class, that the others would take this as an opportunity to get off task. And so I asked him very specifically to observe off-task behavior and see if he could come up with any suggestions. So recognizing that administration is on your side and is not trying to catch you being unsuccessful is a first key step in changing your own mind about getting administrator support. So again, I did invite administration in for an observation that was part of my formal APPR process. Of course, the feedback that I got, the next step is to attempt to implement it and to see if that was successful, recognizing that transitioning out of the Prussian paradigm and into something different is a process, and engaging with those who can support this process is very key. As I mentioned, I made flipping effectively part of my APPR goal this year. It's key to recognize as well, and this is especially relevant for my Hilton listeners, that a flipped class supports lots of initiatives that we're working on right now. It is definitely Common Core friendly. A flipped class encourages all of the things that Common Core says our students need. It encourages resilience. It encourages collaboration. It encourages effective use of technology. It encourages collaboration between students and those who work in the real world. All of this, think like a professor, read like a researcher. That is definitely supported in a flipped classroom. It also, specific to an international baccalaureate program, it certainly encourages the same sort of skills that are defined by the IB learner profile. Creativity, connectedness, worldliness, international mindedness are all very relevant to a flipped classroom. If you are clever about how you word and how you attach student evidence or evidence of student engagement to your APPR, I believe that flipped classroom also can support and lead you towards a highly effective rating on the Danielson rubric. If you look at the highly effective category on the Danielson rubric very carefully, you'll notice that to be rated effective, you as the teacher need to be the doer. You need to be establishing procedures. You need to be engaging with students authentically and effectively. You need to be offering feedback. You need to be establishing classroom management and methods by which work is handed in. In order to be highly effective, by contrast, students take ownership of all of the things I just said. And all of that happens in a flipped classroom. Now, your job is to, again, clearly and concisely explain how this autonomy students now have is demonstrative of you being a highly effective educator. A third step that I took to gain administration approval at Hilton in particular was to enroll in a professional development class with Maureen Thayer that's called Educational Coaching. In this course, you choose several goals that you would like to pursue rather independently, and your coach, Maureen, does exactly what it sounds like. She coaches you to improve, to think about things differently. She'll provide you with resources for research, which is actually how I came across the Bergman and Sam's book that we are using for this course. So gaining administrator support is really about making very clear that you have a method to your madness, that you are researching, you are actively trying to pursue what methods you can best instruct students, and that you are taking risks. Having said all of that, I think that future flipped class pioneers will have a little easier job than those of us who started in 2012, 13, or even prior to that, because there have already been some successes and some groundwork laid. So gaining administrator support, I think at this point, starts with expressing an interest in taking this course, and then making sure, as we mentioned in our first session, that you communicate with your leaders that you are involved in a flipped class, so that when parents call and say, I don't understand what's happening, the administrator can understand the context in which your students are operating. Just like I mentioned, getting parent buy-in relies on excited learners. Colleague buy-in is very similar. It will not take long before your students start leaving your class excited about the sort of engagement they are required to demonstrate in order to participate in your class, and sharing that experience with your colleagues, their other teachers. So excited kids is the first step to selling your good instruction. It always has been. I believe it always will be. Your colleagues will begin to ask you questions when your kids are doing great work, when you don't seem to have classroom management issues with even the most difficult students, when your students are excited to do learning on their own outside of class. Your colleagues will begin to ask questions. You need to be able to tell the story. You need to understand the Prussian paradigm. You need to understand why a flipped class better addresses the needs of 21st century learners. So you need to practice telling that story. Along with that, you also need to, I think, expect and learn to appreciate what I'll refer to as haters. We often seek to avoid conflict, and I'm a firm believer that conflict leads to and is a significant part of the change process. So recognize that whenever you change a paradigm, people will be uncomfortable, and learn to appreciate the questions that these critics or these haters are going to ask you. It's a signal from the marketplace that you're on the cutting edge. So while you're on the cutting edge, I think it's important to reflect. It is very easy to go way off the rails when you're on the cutting edge. So reflecting on the subtext to the questions that your colleagues, who are also experts in education, asking you is really key. They force you to get better at telling the story, these critics. I think it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know, but I'll think about it and get back to you if they ask a question that you're just not prepared to answer. It's important then to reflect, think about it, and also get back to them. But to say, I don't know, and I haven't considered that, that's an excellent point, engages your colleagues and lets them know that you're not opposed to their criticism. In fact, that you recognize criticism is one of the things that propels you to be better. I think that these critics help you to identify the most important issues that you need to be able to speak eloquently about.